Hi everyone, my name is Regina Leonard. I'm actually a landscape architect, believe it or not, but I'm the project manager from Milone and MacBroom, and we're working with Steve Rule of Pinnacle Hill Engineering, who actually did your original inspection for the seawall. And we're also working with Landmark Corporation, and specifically Michael Sabatini, who's a civil engineer. And we've, the three of us have collaborated on a lot of projects, and so we are working on this project for you. And so what I'm here today to talk about is our initial assessment. I'm providing a summary and hopefully enough information so that you as a group can make a decision about how you'd like to move forward. And then the next step for us after this is to push conceptual design forward. So we'll look at things a little more in detail, and we'll start to really understand what the construction and cost specifically is going to be for the wall. We've run some preliminary numbers, and I'll talk about that. But I'm going to start today and give an overview. And if anyone has any questions, just feel free to put up your hand. There's no, I don't mind being interrupted. So with that, we'll get going. And I apologize to anyone sitting in the first row, because I'm going to be going back and forth quite a bit. So you all are aware of the project area down at Ruggles Park. And this low timber wall is about 90 linear feet, and we're not really looking at that. That's in good shape. The focus of this project is really the existing seawall. The pier is in great shape. It was replaced recently or repaired. And we're primarily looking at this existing seawall, which is a wood crib structure. When the inspection report was done, it was noted to be it was deteriorating. And so while it's okay today, it really isn't projected to really do its job over the next 5 or 6 years. And so this was born, this project, which basically is looking at some of the options for treatment of the seawall, whether repair or replace in kind or replace with new materials. That was what we were tasked to look at, and to help you as a community make a decision about how you want to move forward. So, and is this in focus? Because my eyes aren't what they used to be, so.
Good enough.
Is it good enough? Okay, I like your style. I like it.
The teeny type on the spreadsheet.
That's okay, because I can't either, so. So essentially, this is just a section elevation of your existing seawall. As you all know, it varies in height. It's a wooden crib structure. So what we did is we looked at some options, and one of the things I'll just point out is that we tried to keep the option lettering system the same as it was in the inspection report. And so that's why we're skipping over a couple numbers. So the options that we were tasked to look at was, number one, an in-kind replacement. So a wooden crib structure with wood fascia. Option D is we were asked to look at a riprap slope. I prefer to call it stone revetment, because that's technically what it is. The stones would be more carefully selected to kind of fit with the environment. Option E is the quarried block wall. It's very similar to what you have on your pier. Option F is a precast concrete wall. Now, one of the things that we recognize, and it was pointed out as part of the early evaluation by the Board of Overseers and the Infrastructure Committee, is that this option would really only be acceptable if it could fit with the historic context. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what we looked at were different options for treating the poured-in-place concrete wall. There are options for texturizing the wall, which we felt weren't going to give you the outcome that, it just doesn't look. It's not going to look like real stone. It's not going to look like real wood. So we didn't move in that direction. I'll talk more about that. What we did look at was we looked at a similar treatment to what your crib wall looks like today. So it'd be the vertical board facing. We also looked at a vertical retaining wall, and again, this is a cribbing type structure. It's a wood structure, and we'll show you pictures of that, and we'll also help you understand kind of what's involved and the costs involved in that. So the evaluation criteria really came out of some of the concerns that we heard from the infrastructure committee about the sensitivity of the wall, what it looks like, what its materials look like, does it fit with the historic village setting? And so context sensitivity is one of the criteria that we looked at. We also looked at, does the wall treatment impact site function? Specifically, what does it mean to your existing use of the area? Some of the options, like the revetment slope, pushes back to where the existing parking is. So we needed to understand what the impacts are and how the site could possibly respond to that. Would it lose function? Would it not lose function? What are the costs associated with that? So we looked at that. We also looked at the constructability. How easy would this wall be to construct? And are there special considerations that we need to be aware of as we're evaluating each option? We looked at affordability. Specifically, the affordability we evaluated on a lot of different levels, but upfront cost was major. So some of these options cost more. Some of these options don't cost as much. But again, we're looking at things that have impact. Would an option require more permitting? Would an option require more site design? Would it be more technically difficult to design? So we looked at that. Durability and maintenance. How long is this wall going to last? Is it going to be something that you're going to look at having to replace in 30 years, or is it something that conceivably could last longer? And what kind of maintenance would the wall require? Is it going to be fairly simple to maintain, or is it going to be something where you're constantly going out there year after year to kind of evaluate and fix things? And the level of permitting, again, this is something that's difficult at this level, but what we did is we consulted with DEP, we looked at some of the requirements around the Historic Preservation Commission, the Army Corps of Engineers, and we evaluated each option based on the perceived level of permitting. Now, just a caveat, there's internally amongst our group a little disagreement about sort of what that level of permitting is likely to be. So we put a caveat to that. As we develop the design more, we'll have a much better understanding. So those are the criteria that we looked at. And so as I walk you through today, each option, those are the criteria that we are evaluating. Sure.
In relation to maintenance with sea level rise
Yeah.
and with the nature of the storms that
Yes.
have been hitting the coast,
Yes.
is that also part of the concept?
We-
Are one of these options better than another when it comes to just gale force winds of water?
We think so. We'll talk about that. And we.
Can you repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. She asked about with the increasing severity of storms associated with environmental changes and sea level rise. Is one option going to be better than the other? And did we look at it? And we did look at options with regard to that. It wasn't one of the major criteria, but of course. I'll talk a little bit about some of the also considerations with the site and how it interacts with the feature. There are some options that are better than others from our standpoint. So the other thing we looked at, the context and sensitivity is a big thing that we need to consider is the historic context. So the integrity of this area, it's a national, it's on the main register of historic places. The park and the pier are contributing elements. So they're integral to the village and the village setting. They're all related. And so we can't take the seawall and look at it in a vacuum. We can't take the site and solve the problems created by a seawall shift because that could impact the village setting. And so just some things to be aware that whenever you get into national landmark status, the Interior, Department of the Interior has guidelines of how you approach decision-making with regard to landscapes and structures, but we're talking mostly landscapes here. And so within that, I think the big thing is there's really two approaches that we could take with this project. One would be kind of preservation. We're going to preserve what's there, and we're going to replace it exactly like it is, and we're not going to do anything else. Part of the challenge with that is that the seawall actually that's there isn't original to the site. So it's different than what was there historically. So preservation really isn't the right option. So that pushes you back into rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is really honoring what's there, but recognizing that there has been an evolution of land use and needs, and so that the design has to respect what's there, not undermine the integrity of what's there, but also potentially accommodate and shift to meet current needs. And so that's the tact we took. So the big thing to know, and this is on the handouts that will be on the website, and also hopefully all of you got a link to it, but really the historic character of the property can't be undermined by decisions that we make with regard to the seawall or to the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, parking and circulation, we understand that, you know, anything we look at with the seawall is going to be related to the parking and the circulation on the site. So, you know, we selected these images just to show you that over the years, there has always been a parking issue. Since the buggy days, you know, the site, it's important to know that the site has always accommodated in an informal way the vehicles that people come to the area in. The site has never been formalized to address parking. And so to address parking formally now would undermine the site. So really our recommendation is acknowledge that the site informally accommodates parking, but not to do things that would change the way the site looks and functions. And so that essentially is where we ended up. That said, I'm going to show you some small adjustments that could be made to accommodate some of those options, like the revetment option that does push back and impact existing parking. So that said, I'm going to move on. The other thing to just point out with regard to the site is that historically there was a lawn area, and this is off, you know, to the side, but historically a lot of activity took place between the loop drive and the ocean. You can see here, you know, this is 1900 or so, and there was a large, not large, but there was a lawn space at the water's edge to accommodate people that wanted to come down with their lawn chairs and sit and look at the ocean and watch the activities. So without really making a recommendation, we're showing you this to say, you know, one of the things that we got asked to look at was, are there different configurations? Since, you know, if we have to move the loop drive back a little bit, are there different configurations that, you know, maybe would be more reflective of what was there historically that might, you know, provide more space and passive park use down at the site rather than it having parking? So that's just something that I'll show you some different configurations. This is the first one. Now, the site treatments, the way we looked at this is we were asked to kind of look at 4 options. This is probably going to give you the best guidance, otherwise it gets a little confusing. I was very confused initially, let me say. So the first, we looked at 4 options. The first option is we didn't provide parking. The second is there lawn area provided? So the first option, yes, lawn area is provided, and that means lawn area between the circle drive and the top of the seawall. Is the circle drive shifted back? Yes or no? First option, no. So essentially the option that you're looking at here is you've got, this is your revetment slopes. This is, you know, stones on a 2-to-1 slope. And what would it look like if you took the parking? So you can kind of see underneath here, this is where the existing parking is happening. And what would it look like if you just left the loop drive where it was and you said, well, this is we're gonna give this back to lawn space so people can sit there in their lawn chairs and look. And we're gonna shift that parking somewhere else. So essentially, you know, we kind of mimicked your boulders. We're not really making a design recommendation at this point, but we're just showing kind of what that might look like. So the other things to pay note of is option A is not going to change. We're showing the revetment seawall because that has the most impact to the site.
Explain the revetment. Is that a wall or is that?
That's the riprap slope, so it goes down at kind of a 2-to-1, so it's fairly steep, but you could still walk over it. So, but that takes up the most space, and so we wanted to show that because it has more impacts to the site. You could use these scenarios with any of the options that you choose. So the lawn area in this one, what we did is we kind of looked at the pinch areas. Like the pinch point, how wide is the lawn area in this if you don't move the loop drive back? And again, this might change when we go into conceptual design. We might find that that gets pinched even more, right? Or you might have more lawn space. We won't know for sure till we get into design. But in this scheme, you have about an 8-foot wide, so enough for passage and enough for people to put chairs on. These areas are a little wider. Your parking and storage area remains unchanged, and that's it. Right now, the pinch point of that is about 33 feet wide. So I'm just showing you these so that you have a point of comparison as you're looking at each one.
Excuse me, what is the dashed bluish line, purple blue line?
So yeah, this is just the setback and the normal high water line.
75-foot setback.
Yeah, the normal high water line.
Or highest annual tide.
That's correct. So this is the second option. The second option is there is parking provided. There's no lawn area provided. And the circle drive is shifted back a little bit. So this is where the circle drive is now, if you can see that. And then this darker shaded portion is kind of it shifted back. So essentially the impact of that is that this loses, you know, about 8 feet in space. And this gets shifted back. So there's still parking here. This is your loop drive. And then this space just gets squished a little bit.
How many parking spaces are we talking there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Probably 12. Yep. I mean, that's on a good day. And you know, the other thing too, just as a note, I mean, we always run into this. When you have gravel parking lot and you don't have like your spaces defined, you could have 5 people parking there because they're not good parkers, right? And then you could have, like, on a really good day, 12, right? So it's always hard. So in this scheme, you know, parking area, we're showing all the parking when we're showing the area at 18 feet. That's a typical kind of pull-in parking spot for vehicles. On this one, parking's provided, a lawn area is provided, and we're actually shifting that circle back even farther. So what that does is that kind of pinches this a little bit more. It pinches the lawn area a little bit more, but you still have your parking there. And of course, this, from a site development perspective, this is going to be the most expensive option because you have to repave and you have to like do some excavation to prep new area for driveway.
Is the lawn area behind the parking? Is it front of it?
Yeah, this is the lawn area we're talking about right here.
So there's parking there too, A and B is,
Yep, so this would be parking here. This is the edge, so we've shifted that back a little bit. So the configuration is a little bit different. So in this scheme, the loop drive gets shifted back even more.
I'm confused. So are we showing a lawn area that people are sitting on and then enough space for parking?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
Yep. Yeah, and if you look at that graph, that will tell you kind of how it, again, I told you this was going to be confusing.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
You have to look at light and dark areas.
Yeah, and also just, look at, if you have any questions at all, just look at this. This is the breakout. So on some of these, we shifted the loop back a little bit more to accommodate the existing parking.
It's still not clear on those two dotted lines.
Why don't we just not pay attention to those right now, because they're not really relevant to our discussion. And, we can look at those later. But really the discussion now that we're looking at is just the site configurations. And I should have probably just taken those off. I apologize. So the final option is essentially that you just looked at, same configuration where you've got the loop drive, it's pulled back, and instead of providing parking, you have a wider lawn area. Accommodates more people. You've got about 25 feet in space in the smallest portion. And again, this is very conceptual, just kind of looking spatially at the area. We haven't actually done design work, but it's just to give you a little bit of understanding of the different options that you have, and to also understand that, this is with the revetment option, which pushes into the site more. So you could do this with any of the options if you wanted to.
And none of these options, the beach area changes, am I correct?
That's correct. So what we're doing is we're holding the base of the existing seawall.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How about when people bring trailers down and launch them? Do you take that into consideration when you're moving the oval?
We're not really changing the relationship of this launch area. So we're keeping that open. We're not narrowing it up. We're kind of keeping that relationship.
And keeping enough so you can turn a trailer?
That's correct. Yep, exactly. It's basically what we're doing is we're taking the exact same configuration and we're just shifting it slightly. Yes.
Is there a reason you can't push the whole seawall out towards the water lower?
Yes, there is a reason. Primarily, the engineers that have done a lot of work with the Department of Environmental Protection, because that was a question I had actually, Hey, we're turning over backwards to try to resolve site issues. Is there a way we could just push forward? And the answer is the DEP most likely would not allow that because of the impacts. And so we might have the ability, where at the base of the seawall there's some blocks that have been set over time. As we get into this, we might be able to gain maybe a foot, but probably we couldn't go farther back. But that's a good question, because I had the same question myself. Yes, sir.
If a lawn area is one of the key issues here, is there any thought to using the area above the kayak storage as a lawn area, which is to the Belfast side?
Yep, yep. To be honest with you, you certainly could use that. It's existing lawn area. It's fairly steep, and so I think that limits it a little bit. This would be more kind of historically in keeping with the location for viewing people swimming and watching kind of some of the activities on the waterfront. But primarily because we were tasked with the seawall, we're looking in that environment. But we did feel that maybe pushing those activities. I mean, you could do that now if you wanted to. We're not making any changes to that. So, yes, sir.
You showed historical pictures of lots of people sitting in lawn chairs on lawns and near, also where we have our sewage disposal plant below the yacht club. The times were a lot different. People didn't dress in shorts and go down on the beach as much. They
Yep.
were pretty formally dressed.
Yep.
Those crowds were a lot larger than almost any crowd that we have these days.
Yep.
You showed a lot of people sitting, looking out at the water from below the yacht club, but nobody does that
Yep.
Except maybe during yacht club potlucks and dinners, and people use
Yep.
that area. So I'm skeptical whether although I like the idea of the look of a lawn, I'm very skeptical whether it's going to get used
Yep.
that way
Yep.
at all.
Well, this is exactly
Almost
the.
never see anybody sitting above where the kayaks are. People go down on the beach, or they sit up
Yep.
farther up on the.
And our job isn't to kind of point you in any of these directions. It's really just to show you. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that we're hoping that you as a community can have, because ultimately it's your decision. What we've shown you is that even if today you chose the revetment option, which takes up more site space, that there's still the possibility to make your current function, preserve your current function. I think the bigger question is just one of, how you want your waterfront to feel. And I'm not here to make, I don't have an opinion on that. That's something that you as a community can discuss and decide. Yes.
Would it be possible to add riprap revetment out towards the water from the existing location of the wall, if not for the full length, for a curved area near the causeway?
You're talking about right in here,
Right.
to be similar.
Just halfway. I know the left-hand side of it is more friendly for foot traffic.
Yep.
And the larger rocks are more to the right.
Yep.
Is it possible to increase revetment area
Toward the water.
toward the water?
I think, unfortunately, I would suspect so. I don't know what that would do to the level of permitting or, but that's something, if you choose today, we want to go with the revetment option. When we go into conceptual design, part of what we will do is we will be meeting with the Department of Environmental Protection to find out kind of what the considerations and just specific guidelines are for design decision making. So I think it is possible, and we'll have to just work with DEP on that.
I have an answer to that, which is that it's Army Corps of Engineers whenever you're filling in wetlands, and you have to have a reason to fill in wetlands, and I suspect that a village corporation has to have some pretty darn good reasons to
Yep.
fill in
Well,
wetlands.
my view is that series of septic tanks is the good reason. We want to protect that in any storm event.
For
And
sure.
whether it's proximate to the right or more distant the other direction or straight ahead, it's still protection.
Yeah, so that would be the process.
Yeah.
Is to apply for Army Corps of Engineers. fill-in.
That's right, yeah. And when we file the permit, it'll automatically go to them. And I think we would have a pre-application meeting just to define what those specific considerations are before we go through the design process. Yes.
What do we do if they totally reject the revetment option? Are they likely to require more stringent treatment of the wall, or are they likely to not allow it altogether?
I think the likelihood of them not allowing you to stabilize the slope is probably very small. I would say, I think that as long as we do our due diligence and we maintain kind of the existing footprint to the extent possible, that one material versus another material is probably not going to be a deal breaker.
But it does intrude into the shoreline zone farther.
But it doesn't intrude in the other direction, which is kind of where the concern would be. So I think it would be suitable option. And I'll talk about sort of each option and some of the pros and the cons of each option. That's what we're going to work on next. But I think that, those are things that as we get into the process, will get answered, but I think the likelihood of them rejecting a revetment option is probably very small. Yes, sir.
Does the revetment versus a vertical wall scenario, does the revetment do a better job in storms, with rough seas coming in? Talk about
I would say yes. I will say this, the way we looked at these was specifically those five or six, the 6 criteria that we outlined. So storm surge, I think we would say that probably a riprap slope would probably handle it better than a vertical wall. But I'm not a marine engineer, so I wish Steve was here. He could probably address you better than I can. Go ahead, Mike.
I think the answer is yes and no.
Yeah,
It really depends on which way the storm's coming in.
that's right, yeah.
One of the benefits of the revetment is that it really handles it in every direction.
Right,
The wall, if it has a blunt head.
yeah. It'll just push the surge someplace else.
And then one last thing, I did look at that, what you're concerned, Beverly, over on that corner there. And I think when we pulled it back, if we did this option, we would have to put in some granite blocks. We'd pin them to the existing causeway, trying to get them to match.
Yeah.
A little bit for that, think of a triangle. There's a triangle that will be cut out. So we would do that, and then we put rocks in front of it, so.
Well, visually, that's a continuation of the treatment of that face of the causeway, which
Right.
has the granite
Right.
upper and the
Right.
revetment
Yeah.
lower.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we'd have that, and then there would be some rocks that would be allowed in front of that too. Similar to the other side. If you look at the other side, we have 3 blocks, and then all
Yeah.
huge.
So, yeah, that's one thing we'd be looking at is, how those work together, and, we don't want to create any problems. Yes, in the back first.
All I ask is the people in the front, could you please speak in a louder voice or turn your heads or something? And we can't
Oh, I'm sorry, I should be repeating the
Yeah, for the
questions.
video as
I
well.
apologize.
the comments. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't you say that the riprap revetment is really much closer to what the natural shoreline was back in 1849 before we all...
There you
moved
go.
in here?
Absolutely. He asked whether the revetment slope was more closely aligned to what was there originally, sort of a natural shoreline. So that leads me right into, if we don't have any more questions about the site piece, yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, when we're talking about a riprap revetment, how large a stone do you, is it actually passable? Can you walk down the slope?
So right now, what's near the yacht club, that revetment slope, is very, very similar to that.
This one will be steeper.
Yeah, it'll be steeper.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you're not talking small stone like you see along the side of the
No,
highway, which
because
is
that
big
would be
as a
gone
riprap.
tomorrow.
You're talking big boulders.
Yes.
Do it if their balance is good.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, well, I'm going to move on. So now we're going to work into the different treatment options. And again, Steve Rule couldn't be here today. He could probably be much more eloquent with these different options. But these were the options that were addressed as part of the original Seawall inspection report. And so if you want more information about that, I would reference you to that inspection report. But I'll try to answer as many questions as I can today. So the in-kind repair would actually be an in-kind replacement. It can't be really repaired. It needs to be replaced in whole. We can call it what we want, but it's an in-kind replacement. So when we looked at this, we looked at the different criteria for this, and I'm just going to go through these a little bit, and realizing that we have a lot of these to get through, why don't we do this? Why don't we get through these, and then we'll take questions. So with this particular option, obviously it doesn't impact your site function because it would stay exactly the same if you wanted it to. Context sensitivity, it works pretty well with the context of the site. I think it was in place when the landmark status was granted, so it's not changing that, even though it originally wasn't what was there. Constructability, the nice thing about this option is that it can be prefabricated off-site and then moved in pieces. And what that would do is that would allow you to better work with the tide cycles. Some of these require a cofferdam, maybe. And this is where we run into kind of this internal dialogue between kind of our marine contractor and our, marine structural engineer. There's a difference of opinion. We kept a budget for the cofferdam into our original assessment. And the reason that we did that is because it's conservative. And the whole purpose of what we're doing today is to be on the conservative side. Once we select something and we can work out those details, during conceptual design and technical design.
Could you define cofferdam for me, please?
Sure. So the cofferdam, and I'm probably, Mike, you can jump in and help me if I if I start sinking on this one. So basically, the cofferdam system is just to keep the tides at bay. So it's just to keep the area dry so that they can get their equipment in there and excavate. And there's a cost associated with that of about $100,000, a little over. So it's.
You drive metal sheeting in, and you continuously are pumping.
So it's a big expense, and what it does do is it frees up the contractor to just get in there and do it without really consideration for the tides. And so if you have a crunch on your construction period, or you have contractors that don't want to sort of work around tide cycles, then the cofferdam is your option. It's expensive. And we added that in just conservatively.
I think the ironic thing is, because we're being proactive here, we can come up with a plan that might not need the cofferdam.
Yeah.
But if we had a breach in the wall, we would have to have a cofferdam
Yep.
to do the fix. So
Right. So, it's got pros and cons, but we carried it in the budget just to be safe. So the affordability for this, you would think wood would be cheap. But it's fairly complicated, to construct. It's got a lot of different layers to it. So in terms of the cost, it's a fairly high cost as opposed to the other options that we're going to look at. Durability and maintenance, you know what you have there now, and you know what it is to maintain that and what sort of the longevity of that wall is. Obviously, you're looking at a similar situation. So it gets dinged a little bit in the assessment for that. The level of permitting for this is, we think perhaps that this could be permitted as a permit by rule, which is the simplest form of the NERPA permitting. But there is a chance, depending on sort of what the approach is and where the final design ends up, that it could be the level of permitting that's the same as the other options. So there's a chance it could be a very simple permitting. There's a chance it could be a higher level of permitting. We don't know that for sure right now. Yes, Paul?
We have an installer here, a wall installer, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to get his opinion.
Sure thing.
On this particular
Sure thing.
Option.
Yep.
That's Mr. Bernanke.
Well, I actually just have a few questions, and one is, has anyone done a underlying geology test of this area yet?
That isn't part of what we have been assigned to do, but certainly wouldn't be a bad idea.
Because I've seen a lot of failures of the revetments at the toe level because all the weight of the rocks is transferred directly down the slope into the foundation level,
Yep.
the toe level.
Yep.
And I think that's so far, one of the considerations that I have, and I'd like to hear about the rest of the options.
Yep.
Through your report. There are reasons why there are so many crib structures on the Bayside
Yep.
bluff arrangement, because it's a highly unstable slope.
Yep.
And what's there now looks like it's really stable, but that's only because it's been stabilized by the rocks and the existing crib work.
Yep.
So maybe,
Yep.
maybe we could talk more about the structural stabilities
Sure.
and the difficulties with the foundation level approach after all the options have been gone through.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say this caveat. I'm a landscape architect,
I got that.
not a structural engineer. However, I would certainly, invite and welcome if you want to speak specifically with Steve Ruhle, who is the designer, the engineer that's working with us, to address those. The other thing I would put out there is that while it's not in the scope of services of what we were asked to do for this project, that Milone and MacBroom, we do have geotechnical resources, and we can get to the site and do whatever you feel is required before we get into any kind of technical level of design. It may not be required for the next level of concept design, but certainly we could certainly do that. So I'll just put it out there.
When you talk about permitting, is that a financial issue or is that a time issue or both?
It's both, but I would say its majority is time. So permit by rule is 14 days. When you're looking at a much greater timeline, the higher level the permitting goes. So it's just a consideration. But that we can back into that when you select something.
We're considering construction no earlier than 2020 anyway, so I don't think permitting really plays into that timeline as much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
With this option, would you also face the cribbing on the water side as it is now?
That is how we looked at it, yes. It is an in-kind replacement. And I'm just saying, Steve Ruhle felt that that was helping preserve the crib work, that he had some concern about the exposure of the crib work if it didn't have that facing on it. So option D is the next option that we looked at. And again, I think someone mentioned historically what was there, and this is around 1900, probably a little bit earlier than that. Beverly, correct me if I'm wrong. So this is the stone revetment option, also called the riprap slope. We are showing it at a 2-to-1, and the reason is that, we're trying to impact the site function as little as possible. And so while we'd like to do a 3-to-1 slope, more like what's near the yacht club, we had to steepen it a little bit for the purposes of preserving site function. So obviously this, as we talked about, has impacts to the existing parking on site, and it would require either relocating that parking or pushing the loop drive back to accommodate it. The context sensitivity, this one is probably the strongest in terms of the context sensitivity because it relates more strongly to what historically was there. Constructability, it's relatively simple to construct. There's a couple of ways that you can go about it. You can just dump the rocks, right, and just let them fall where they may after you prep. Or you can individually place the stones. And we opted to go with the individual placement because we felt like you'd get a better look, a better aesthetic with that, and also, it allows us to kind of better place those stones. It's relatively straightforward to construct this. The affordability is the lowest of all that we looked at. Even when you add the site adjustment cost to it, it's still the lowest cost. And I will say this, that every option is going to have site costs, no matter what, because you have to open up the wall area, you're going to impact some of the areas, you've got heavy equipment on drives, so every option has a site cost associated with it. The durability and maintenance of it, the maintenance requirements overall are low. Think about the revetment slope in front of the yacht club. Durability is high, and the estimated life cycle span is higher than some of the other options that we looked at.
Where's the location of the existing vertical wall in relation to that?
Can you see that, Beverly, right here? Yeah, that's the existing wall location, sure. The next option is the granite block option. And again, this option is very similar to your pier. And so, you know, we just show, this is Rockport, Massachusetts. It just kind of shows what those look like. You already know because you have a pier that's made that way. So we just put the option together to look at what a granite block wall, similar height would be. Again, no impacts to really the site functionality. Context sensitivity, we feel that this is a good fit. It ties in with the granite block that you have in place. It's a vertical treatment, which you already have, and the materials are natural materials that fit. So we scored that high on context sensitivity. Constructability, blocks would be locally sourced, of course. They weigh a ton. No pun intended. And so, you know, they likely, you know, getting them there would take some understanding of how to do it, either by water or, you know, bringing them in otherwise. And then the equipment that you would need to kind of move and set these in place. So it's probably a similar process to what you used to build the pier or repair the pier recently. Durability and maintenance is high on this. You know, once these are in place, they do a really good job. And the level of permitting, we think, is, again, internally, you know, we have some disagreements on this, but to be safe, you know, it would likely require a higher level of permitting than the in-kind replacement.
How about the revetment? Would it be more?
It may be the same as the revetment, to be honest with you. The precast concrete block. So this is the, it was recently actually used at the Union Bridge repair. I think this is, where is this? I can't remember where this is. Up the coast. But this is what it looks like. And it's a concrete made to look like stone, which doesn't really look like stone. It does a good job stabilizing. Construction of this, they're pretty easy. They kind of lock in pretty easily. You still need large equipment to kind of set these in place. They tend to be very durable and have, you know, fairly moderate construction costs, material costs. Again, you're looking at probably that higher level of permitting for this. I think the big ding for this one, in our opinion, is that it really, there's nothing you can do to make this fit into the historic context. It's not a material that you can put a facing on because these blocks are intended to kind of shift. And so, you know, putting something on them is just, you'd have a maintenance nightmare on your hands. So we did not rate this very high, this option. The next option is the cast in place. And again, I talked about this a little bit before. This is just, I wanted to show you this example of a textured wood treatment. So there's different ways that you can texture these walls. One of the things that we heard when we first got involved is, can you look to see if you can put some kind of stone masonry on it? And we felt like that was just going to lead to maintenance headaches. This is going to take the full brunt of the ocean, and there's no masonry that's going to be easy, and it would just be a nightmare to try to maintain that. So we thought about other options that could address kind of what we thought was not visually in keeping with the area. And again, you know, you could get a look very similar to your existing wall with the vertical boards, and so that's how we priced it. And in looking at that, if this was just a cast-in-place concrete seawall, it would be fairly high in terms of its, you know, it would be high in terms of its durability. But once you add that wood element on, it gets dinged on that because it starts to, you start to introduce an element that has a higher level of care and maintenance. The good part of this is that, like the other vertical walls, there's no loss in site function. With the vertical facing, it would look very similar to what you have currently for your existing seawall. It falls kind of in the moderate range of upfront costs. Yes?
On the precast wall, why do you think that would be maintenance nightmare.
Oh, well, to address the fact that contextually it doesn't really support, it's not historically appropriate in terms of the aesthetic. So you couldn't address it with like a vertical facing because they move. And so
Oh, without the facing.
without the facing, it was our opinion that they weren't historically appropriate. Okay.
But as for its maintenance, you mentioned that you thought it would be a nightmare.
Well,
Is there something about the precast concrete?
no, sorry, I missed. So in and of themselves, if we're just looking at the maintenance, they scored high.
Yeah.
Okay, they would be low maintenance. But the aesthetic and sensitivity to the context, they got dinged.
So because they're concrete, it's not necessarily a liability, except for the appearance and
Right.
context.
That's right.
So they would hold up for a good long time.
They would.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So on this scheme, durability and maintenance, as I said, got dinged. The costs are moderate affordability. Again, we're looking at a similar level of permitting as the other wall options. And then this is, now if you're familiar with the inspection report, Steve showed a different type of vertical wall in that report. He showed a steel type of vertical wall. On this one, we knew that we had to do something that was more in keeping with the site, and so we moved to a timber bulkhead vertical wall. And so this is an example of what that might look like. So again, we're not looking, you don't have loss to the parking. The context sensitivity, we felt that the wood sheathing would, it wouldn't be inappropriate, but maybe not as appropriate as some of the other treatments. So it got moderate level for there. Constructability, like the wharf, it requires sort of pile driving, and it requires, so there might be the constructability, there are some things to think about, so it's got a moderate level of constructability. The affordability, again, it falls kind of in the mid-range. And the durability and maintenance, we scored that as moderate because, again, it's got the wood elements and the vertical boards that would need to be maintained over time. The level of permitting is very similar to the other options. And finally, we were asked to look at a hybrid. And so what we looked at was combining a revetment with a secondary small seawall that could actually serve as a seat wall if you wanted to. So if you think about that area opening up and there's lawn area behind it and you want to just sit and take in the views, this option provides that. And I'll say also that if there are safety concerns and you don't want to sit on it, we can also put a railing on it. So it provides kind of a combination of vertical, saves you a little bit of horizontal distance, not much, but a little bit. The good thing about this is that you do have the revetment in the front, which can kind of dissipate some of the wave action a little bit. It incorporates elements that are already out there, the granite, the stone revetment, so it mirrors what's out there. So for that reason, we kind of scored it high on the context sensitivity. Constructability, it's pretty straightforward. Again, setting the granite blocks does require some larger equipment. Affordability, it's, believe it or not, this tends to be in the lower end of the affordability, which is good. The site work costs on this option, again, like the revetment option, might require an added expense. But again, even with the added expense, it still falls within the lower range of affordability. Maintenance requirements are low and the durability on this is high. And again, probably a full level permitting for this. Yes, sir.
So it looks to me like the slope of the small part of revetment versus the granite, you continued that up. It looks like the revetment and this approach, you'd lose all the parking along there.
So One of the things that we did is when we looked at those site options for the parking, is we would have, this would cause, if you want to retain the parking, it would cause a shift back of the loop. Yes?
My concern with this option would be that ultimately the wave action would undermine the granite, or undermine the granite base, and cause it to sag and require eventually readjusting the cap wall,
Yeah.
the top of the wall. That would be a concern. I'm not sure how you would construct the base,
Yep.
except with stone, more of the same.
Yep.
But I think there'd be movement in the wall
Yep.
because of the wave action.
Yep, that's a good point. Yes?
When you did the cost estimates for each of these, some of them involve shifting the parking, shifting the circle. Are those included in your cost evaluations here?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on durability? We have a high and a low. How many years is high and how many years is low in a real rough sense?
Well, for comparison's sake, I think, when we thought about durability, we think about sort of what you have out there now as kind of the lower end of the durability. So 30 years would be kind of a lower end of durability. Durability, we also consider kind of how much maintenance does it take for it to be durable, and so we were looking at those. And it's hard to say. We don't know what storms are coming down the pike, but as far as like granite walls, I mean, there are granite walls that have been there for hundreds of years, and so, conceivably, if you build it and you don't get really massive storms, that, you might look at having your granite wall for a very, very long time, for generations. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned that the 2-to-1 slope of the revetment is not ideal. What's the chance that permitting would allow a shallower slope, say 3-to-1,
Yeah.
but going into the water more, keeping the top end where it is
I
now?
think that there might be the allowance for us to kind of meet, the bottom of the revetment could probably meet where there's existing stone that are serving as a revetment, but again, we'd have to coordinate and make sure that was a viable option. As far as kicking it back the other way, beyond that, I don't think we'd be able to do that. However, if we heard today that, hey, we think we could lose the parking on the waterfront side, then that opens it up so that you could have a shallower revetment if you wanted to.
In your comparison of options, or at any point in developing, do you consider how long the construction would take? I'm particularly interested in how that would affect other uses in the park.
Yep.
And when you think, based on that, would be the best time in the season to do it.
Yep.
Because I think that has a wider impact beyond just the construction. It has an impact upon the whole community.
Yep.
So I don't know whether those have been scored into your...
I have to be honest, we did not evaluate that as part of the process. It certainly is something to keep in mind. In our experience, we're so used to, once we know what the approach is to working around timelines, that's kind of where we took it. We didn't, that wasn't part of our initial evaluation process.
Just a general comment about that. It's only 120 feet long, and my guess is if all the ducks were in place for any of these options, and you started on November 1st when everybody's gone home,
Yep.
that by May 1st it would be all done and the grass would be growing.
Yep. Yep.
That's my general impression.
So
Yeah.
you work through the winter?
Yeah, and winter is actually the ideal time because dealing with small cars and traffic is a nightmare.
Yeah.
Joggers.
Yeah.
This morning coming in, I had to stop several times for dogs and kids.
Yeah, there'd be, we're just so used to living in Maine, you're so used to kind of working around tourist season. I will say the exception is obviously the roads. They always wait till it's tourist season to construct their roads, but,
That enters into truck traffic coming into the village.
Yep.
To support the
Yep, exactly, yep.
And that would be an important consideration for the town and the town.
Yeah, and that's something that, when you select the option that you want to move forward with, and we get into kind of technical design, which is, after concept design, we'll move into technical design. That's when we're going to be really thinking about that. When's the construction timeline? And we'll build that into, the whole upfront. So when do you bid it? What are your parameters that you're giving the contractor that they have to know about? And posting roads may be a part of that. So, where do we end up? So, yeah, you're not going to be able to read it. I apologize. It's only so big I can make this because it's quite a complicated table. But I would say that this handout is available online, and so you can look at it there. And there's also a couple more handouts. So you want a handout? No. Okay. Anybody? Anybody want a handout? Oh, I lied.
We took them off.
Sorry. So essentially, I'm not going to spend a ton of time because we already went over how we kind of rated everything. But I wanted to show you. This is what we call the decision matrix cost table. So how do we get to costs? And again, I'm going to thank the infrastructure committee for sort of helping us figure out how to do this. So what we did is, on all the options, we looked at things like the initial cost. What's the design and engineering cost? It's going to be greater for some of the options than it is for others. What's the maintenance cost? So what we did is we rated these options high, medium, or low. No, it's not that scientific. And based on that, the high cost we assigned a point to. Medium we assigned 2 points. And low cost we assigned 3 points. And at the end of the day, we tallied up out of a possible 9 points, where did it fall? And then we translated that to the design matrix point system. So when you look at the design matrix and you see 13 points for one of the options, the quarried granite wall, 13 points, you can look at this cost table in your handout and you can see how we got at that. And I've already talked about all this, so I'm not going to get into it, but this is how we arrived at that for the decision matrix, which is that. And again, we've already gone through all of these, but if you're interested, we basically took every one of these criteria, we assigned a value of 20 points. And so the total scoring, the highest you could get is 120 points. And then we took that and we tabulated the results. So at the end of the day, which ones of these scored the highest? Which ones of these didn't score didn't score well? So what we did is we took the 4 highest options and we brought these forward and said, we recommend that you consider these 4 options. And then the remainder ones, for simplicity for today, we said, we don't think you should consider these options. So which options did we say? So the top scoring option was the quarried granite. And I'll say again, we had internally some disagreement about the quarried granite stones and whether or not they'd trigger a higher level of permitting. So the score on this was between 93 and 95. So we ended up with, we went with the 95 for this one. But it's very similar to the scoring for the stone revetment and the hybrid stone revetment and granite block option. So those were the highest 3 scorings, and it was followed by the in-kind replacement, which scored 89 points. So those were the 4 that we said, we think that you should consider this based on our assessment. These are the 4 options that we think you as a community should be discussing and talking amongst yourselves to decide how you want us to proceed with design. There's a couple of considerations. Again, you know, we talked about sort of site impacts. Some would require shifting the site back, which would result in some pinch points to some of the existing boat storage that you have on the back side. Something I haven't talked about, and it's really an option for the revetment option and possibly for the hybrid option, depending on whether or not you decide you want a handrail on that. But the revetment option eliminates the need for a handrail. And so you kind of get that open view back that historically has been there. And so for that, I mean, I think just from my standpoint as a landscape architect, looking at the historic photos, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do that as a community.
What would be the barrier for a vehicle going straight out?
Well, it would be the same barrier as, you know, we would integrate some type of barrier into the design. And when we looked at the site options, we were just for the sake of showing something, a similar treatment is using the boulders. But, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you could do it. Yeah.
Did you consider alternative parking arrangements?
We considered whether the loop could move back and whether the parking could remain in its current location. And that's as far as we got. And I will say this. We began our work looking at the site, and we knew parking was an issue. And when we first got involved in the project, we said, let's sit down and really take a look at the site and how it's functioning, and let's just find extra parking. We can do it. We're really good at this. So that's what we did. And we looked at it and we said, we can't do it. We can't do it because the site is at capacity. And the only way you could do it is to change how people use parking. And the only way to do that is to pave it and stripe it. Because otherwise people are going to use it the way they do. And we don't want to do that. We don't think it's, well, it's certainly not appropriate. The other thing is, I didn't talk about the impacts to all of you who are sitting there and using the park or looking out your windows and looking down at the water. You know, it's bad enough to have a car kind of using the gravel shoulder or the grass, but I'm sure that you don't want to look at a paved parking lot. So we decided pretty quickly that that wasn't the right approach. And so where we ended with that was, let's see if we can adjust the loop, have minimal impacts to the site. You can continue to use the site informally to allow the current capacity if that's your choice. Our recommendation would be that if you decide that you want to take back some of that lawn area at the waterfront because you don't want to look at cars, you want to look at ocean, that's going to displace the vehicles. And how you program that, whether it's find remote parking, whether it's restrict parking, that's a bigger discussion that we shouldn't be involved in. But what we will say is that the site is at capacity. You all know it's at capacity. You're not going to find any more parking on the site. So any change that you make, you know, the parking's going to get displaced. But the good news is if you don't want to displace parking, you really don't have to, and we can shift that circle back. So I think with that we just... Sure.
The change of modern society and cars.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I don't know any of you because I'm on the edge, the other side. You know, I'm one of the new people across from the Samways.
Welcome.
Thank you. Consequently, I'm a driver who uses that parking area quite a bit.
Yep.
And I'm a lawn person because once I'm at Ruggles, I stay. Because my 8-year-old's jumping off the wharf and I sit on that bench with my dogs and I look at people's bumpers. You know, when you sit in the circle, there's nothing to look at but cars, right? So, and I don't want to go out to the wharf because then I'm going to get pushed in the water and I don't want to jump off. I don't want to jump off, right? So I sit in that little bench and I look at cars, right? And nobody utilizes the lower part of the lawn because you just look at cars, right? So we're all up at the tree, but that's too far away from my kid, right? So I'm either on the wharf or at that bench, right? Looking at cars. So I'm going to disagree that if there was some lawn space there, it would be ideal. It would be completely, I mean, that would be, you know, beach living for those of us who aren't in the village. And I think you'd find that a lot of the people who are driving our kids down to Ruggles Park would be sitting in a little lawn area looking at the ocean instead of looking at cars. So I just wanted to put that
Yeah,
opinion out there that
Yeah.
for those of us who can't walk to it and have to drive to it, I would give up not being able to park there
Yeah.
to be able to look at the ocean
yeah,
instead of cars.
yeah.
Can we make that little loop smaller to accommodate movement? I mean, is that?
I don't, it's about as small as it can get, really, to function, yeah.
We have to have the trucks come in for the wastewater treatment.
Oh, right, that's true. Right, so make it smaller.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Could you or someone else here, talk about the inspection report? I'd like to know more information about leaving things the way they are now, instead of spending. Are you going to talk about costs at all? I mean, in dollars and cents?
I can, if you'd like to hear
Let's start
costs.
with the inspection report.
Okay, so the inspection report was done, was it a year ago, 2 years ago? So Steve Rule, who's our structural marine engineer, did an inspection of the seawall and determined that there was decay in the existing crib work. And his, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that he said, you know, probably you'd have to do some major repairs within the next 5 years. You could leave it, but you can't avoid repairing it or replacing it. And so the infrastructure committee and the board of overseers, I think, are trying to be proactive, understanding that the outreach and design and decision-making process will take a while. And so I think that was the essence of the finding, was that, you know, and I think we showed some pictures of it, and if you go down there, you can see that it's, you know, it has a life of maybe 5 years left.
And we really don't fully know how bad it is, because to do that, we have to put the park.
Yep.
And the stuff on the outside is falling apart. So the stuff on the inside that's attached to the dirt has to be falling apart. So it's one bad storm, and we're out there with cofferdams trying to fix it.
Yeah. Yes.
And I should point out that we wouldn't even be having this meeting if we already had either a quarry granite wall or a stone revetment.
That's probably true, yeah.
We-
Yeah.
Let me talk a little about the cost and those
Sure.
being on the overseas will remember this. I don't think the village should go this alone. Anything we present should also be presented to the town. We only ask them for $25,000 a year regularly. This is not an asset exclusively to the village corporation. This is an asset to the town of Northport. And in all of our planning, we should be involving the town, because frankly, they need to contribute beyond just $25,000 a year to the village corporation. So I just want to put that out there. I think it's an important consideration, and we should all be making sure the town will be involved, I think, in some way in permitting, but they ought to be involved in funding. They did Saturday Cove, time to do the village.
They contributed a lot to the wharf when that happened, didn't they?
The excise tax.
Yeah, with the boat excise tax.
So I know we're getting kind of short on time, and the purpose of the meeting today is really to find out how you as a community want us to proceed. What option would you like to proceed with? So I would like to just get a show of hands of people, number one, who feel like they're decided on one of the options or leaning toward one of the options. Raise a hand who's leaning toward making a decision today. 3 people. 4. Okay.
And I'm not part of that group or community voting either. I just work here.
Okay.
But did I hear relative costs for these out of the new figures?
I can.
Be a factor we want to know.
Here we go. You asked for it. I'm going to give it to you. Keep in mind that these are high-level costs. And keep in mind also that we're carrying a cofferdam in these costs, which is, as I said before, I think we're carrying $112,000 for a cofferdam on some of these.
Which may or may not be needed.
Which may or may not be needed, so you might be able to drop $100,000 right out of some of these. The other thing we're doing is we're carrying a railing on all of these. And so we have a cost, same cost for all of these in the railing. So what we did is we priced a material cost for each of these options. We priced a labor and equipment cost for these options, the railing cost, the cofferdam cost, and we came up with a budget for the wall cost. That includes a healthy contingency of 15%.
Can I interrupt? Does the contingency include, is that for the permitting process as well, or is that separate?
The permitting typically is handled separately, so any costs related to the permitting, we haven't included in here. It does not currently, but again, the soft costs tend to be around 7-10% of your cost. So just keep that in mind. Then we also looked at site work. We looked at a budget for the site work. So I'll talk a little bit about that because we've talked so much about it. Now, we didn't price out every single option we showed. What we did is we gave you a range for what you could expect. So if you're talking about putting the site back to exactly the way it is after the seawall construction, you probably want a budget somewhere in the range of, $15,000, $25,000 for that to rebuild. If you're looking at wanting to maybe move the loop back and repave the loop and then, loam and seed and place boulders around to stop traffic, you probably want to carry, somewhere in the range of like $65,000 to $75,000 for that. So that's kind of your site range of costs. In terms of the wall range, and I'm going to just look at each of these options because based on what we talked about today, you know which options kind of have the site-related costs and which have less site-related costs. So the in-kind option that we're looking at, kind of the pricing for that is probably going to be around $300,000 with everything combined, up to a high of $400,000, $450,000. And then this is, again, we base this on meeting with a marine contractor and also our engineering costs that we are seeing in the field. So that's the combination, that's the range in pricing for an in-kind replacement. The revetment option is you're looking between probably $120,000 to $170,000 in that range. The quarried granite, you're probably looking at around $315 up to like $425 for your range. Precast block, around $200 to up to around $280, $285 for that option. Cast in place, again, this has the wood facing on it. You're looking anywhere from around $260 up to $360 for a range in costs. And for the hybrid option, you're probably looking around $150 as the low, up to around $210, $215 as the high. And again, big disclaimer, these are high level looks at the cost. But that's the expected range of costs that you can anticipate.
Did the quarried granite?
We did the quarried granite option. The quarried granite option, I think around, we said $315 up to, what did I say? $425. Yes.
And just for clarification for what is and is not these numbers, you covered it all, I just want to make sure I recorded
Yeah.
it correctly. So the costs you just stated are for the wall, including a 15% contingency, including a cofferdam for all options.
No, the cofferdam is for all options except for the stone revetment and the hybrid option.
Okay, that's good, thank you. And then soft costs, which are really engineering design, 7 to 10%.
7 to 10% typically.
And included in those is none of the site work because we have to figure out what we want to do.
Well, that's a good point. So the site work that we kind of ran with was assuming that you would be shifting back the wall all the way, and if we had to excavate all the gravel out at the front and put in loam and seed. So we felt like that was probably the more expensive option, so that's the one that we priced as the 75 grand. So
But that's not rolled into the wall cost.
it's rolled into those costs that I just listed out.
It is rolled.
It is. Yep. Yep.
Would a contractor be required to restore a laydown area if they disturb, let's say the uphill side where, on the other side of the building?
Well, we would have to make provisions, obviously, for contractor laydown. And that's something that we would work with the Village Corporation on. We would just find a suitable location that's not too far where that could happen.
I just gave him the copy.
Oh, you did? It's a little different. I improvised. Oh, good. I improvised. I improvised on the cost a little bit in adjusting it to round numbers.
The main cost consideration question that I have, listening to the whole presentation, is that the guy who runs the company that makes the precast concrete blocks
Yep.
stated to me that, well, at 10 feet or 11 feet high, and that's another thing we haven't talked about, is sea level rise, increasing the height of this.
Yep.
He stated that, well, I think it could be a gravity wall, but I can't say that. The main consideration is what is the underlying soil structure for this.
Yep.
And with the revetment and with the replacement log crib, that would be a whole lot less of a consideration.
Mhm.
Essentially, a revetment lies against the land, and it might settle, but it's just going to keep lying there.
Yep.
And the log crib does the same thing. It spreads its weight effect out over 3 times the area. And so with both the granite block and the concrete block, which would be considered a gravity wall or maybe even a tied back wall, you would still have the weight of the structure of the thing to put a foundation underneath. And it seems that knowing what the geotechnical assessment cost of that would be really important to know, to be able to add on to the cost.
Yep.
And that would make your soft contingency costs double or triple maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it would depend on the methodology of the geotechnical work and the locations.
Well, I've been quoted in Bayside $50,000 for
Yep.
a basic survey.
Yeah.
Of 150 feet, 200 feet.
Yeah, and we might be able to get that cost down, if we're strategic and sort of where you want that information. Certainly does impact if you need that information to construct some of these, proprietary walls and some of the other walls. Certainly good insurance policy, but yes, I mean, it definitely, we didn't wrap that in, but certainly would be a good insurance policy to do that. And, if there's interest, we could certainly get some pricing. We can maybe work with you on sort of where strategically we should do that and what the methodology should be to keep your costs down. There's, different ways we can do it. We might be able to reduce costs with test pitting and things like that. So certainly a consideration. Yes?
The options that involve moving the circle back, is it too premature to have a rough idea what that involves, or how much we're talking about?
In terms of cost?
In terms of how far back?
I believe it's between 8 and 10 feet is what we're talking about. So let's just take a show of hands just so I can get, and you can raise your hands twice, how's that? Or 3 times. Yeah, because, yeah, the whole, yeah, I like it. Okay, who's gonna be my vote tabulator? I need somebody to, I'll tabulate. Yeah, let's do it, let's just do a straw poll, and I'd, love to get some ideas here. Let me go back a little bit though, because I wanna read off of this. Let's see, go back. So here are the recommendations, the ought to consider. So we're really only looking at these 4 options. So who here likes the idea of moving forward with an in-kind replacement? 1. That's easy. I can count that high. All right, so B1. Who likes the idea of kind of the stone revetment? This is kind of the riprap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 17. What about the quarried granite wall? Who likes the quarried granite? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. All right, I gotcha. All right, so that was the quarried granite. And then what about the hybrid stone revetment with the granite block? 1, 2.
I'm going to reserve it.
Okay. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Are you voting? 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Did I get 15?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
We can vote twice then.
Yeah, you can.
Well, I'm voting for that one too.
All right, we're up to 17. All right, we got a runoff. Don't you love it? This is just like, just like the governor's race. All right, so we've got the two top preferred options are the stone revetment and the hybrid. So if you had to choose between one or the other, how many would choose the stone revetment? And you can't vote twice on this one, sorry. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. And then who would vote for the hybrid? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay. So where we're ending up, just so you know, is there seems to be a stronger preference for the hybrid option.
It's a community built on compromise. That's what a hybrid is.
That's right. So I think, with that, if there are other questions, I'm happy to take them. Just so you all know kind of where we're going with this next is we'll be digging into the details, and then we're preparing conceptual design so that at your official meeting I believe it's in August, right. Yeah, we'll have some conceptual design to show with you.
So will you do a conceptual design on all of these or just on the top one?
On the top one, yep.
How about the top two?
Well, we can talk to the infrastructure committee and see if they can, if they want us to move in that direction.
We still need to give the community an option.
If, we certainly can work with that, and we just need to work with the infrastructure committee to see how we would do it.
Can I ask, with that hybrid option, what do you do in the riprap to not have the granite shift?
Again, that's something that, we'll work with our marine structural person to make sure that we address that. And here, here's something. It could be that when we start looking at problem solving and those things, which to a degree, maybe looking at two conceptually is probably a good idea, because that would allow us to say, all right, when we told you that it would be this, well, we had to add like 3 feet of wall.
Idea that, in 10 years we get a hurricane.
Yep.
And those stones underneath will get displaced, and then there goes the granite.
Yep, so I'm going to make a note to look at that. We'll talk with the infrastructure committee and see how we want to proceed, but regardless, we'll come back to you in August with a concept or two, and you can make a decision about how you want to proceed at that time. So thanks everybody for your help. Thank you. Thank you.